Our final block-in approach that we're using is the color block-in. Now this is going to be the most recent of all the approaches that we look at. It was popular in the mid-19th century and going later when more colorful pigments became available. Artists started working their canvases in large, bold, colored shapes so that they can step back and see the overall relationships and then begin to whittle them down into more specific shapes. This, for the most part, became what illustration techniques translated into later on. Now, we're going to have the same amount of time to do this assignment, just 3 hours, so you're going to have to make sure you really focus on the larger, more important shapes, the larger, more important colors, relationships, and edges, and then if we have time, we'll start to whittle them down from there. One of the other things to consider is that we want this to be a little more opaque, less thin everywhere. We don't want it to be wishy-washy. We're going for more directly stated color that we would at a later point either soften down or maybe the next day even scrape down and build up on top of. So we want to use firmer brushes, probably not your soft sables. We're going to use something more like bristle brushes. And treat this similar to actually how we had the limited color demonstration on the first term of the master copy. For the most part, it's going to be the same approach, only we're working from a live model now. And we can select at the end if we would want to soften this down or, again, scrape it. Here's an example of earlier this year, color block-in that we were actually able to take up over a couple days. So the next assignment you guys have, you're allowed to select any of these starting methods and develop a figure painting that way. Start with a open grisaille, start with a closed grisaille, or start with a color block-in and then develop it out. So this had 2 days of development on it. And you can still see in some areas here how just the simple color block-in is left over, just these big bold strokes. And then in some of the torso here, since we typically refine from the torso out, we have a little more development, and with the scraping at the end of each session or the next morning after each session, we get the smoother and smoother and smoother paint film transitions all in here. And if we wanted this to really develop out, we could keep adding the paint, adding the paint, adding the paint. We get more subtle transitions, we get smoother canvases as it starts to fill in all of the pores. Or we could move out and develop the whole together. So the choice is yours, but it should mimic at least something like what we have in here, just simple, direct block-in of the figure here. And this will give us a nice, strong sense for the overall color relationships in the figure, and that's really what we're going for here. This is a more advanced, more difficult method of blocking in because it's going to require not only an understanding of our shape ability right away, but our values and our edges all have to be pretty good as we lay things on. You don't necessarily need to soften things out as you go. Again, I'll recommend that you wait until a little later to soften or scrape. But overall, it's just going to require more skill to execute this type of block-in. Now, if you're going to be an alla prima painter, you typically would use some bit of medium in here as you lay the paint in so that you can layer a little more easily with your softer brushes later on. So a medium diluted with a little bit of thinner would be appropriate for this stage. Just keep in mind that that sometimes if you use too much medium, it might run, too little medium, and the paint gets kind of clumpy. And medium can have a tendency to fuse colors together a little bit more after you lay them down and let them sit for a moment or two. So you want to kind of anticipate that. Also, you want to make sure that you don't stretch your paint too much. And that's, I think, the most common errors students make when utilizing medium for something like this, like a color block-in, is they find a color that they like and they want to redistribute it elsewhere, but they don't have the confidence to remix it, so they'll just add some medium or stretch out that color so that they can put it everywhere else. And that will ultimately lower the quality of your paint application and edges, and quite frankly, it changes the color of the paint quite a lot as we start to get more and more transparent. So we want to anticipate that before we use too much medium. So with this, you do have the option, and this goes for all other types of block-ins. Even though by now you have some experience with the open grisaille, you have some experience with the closed grisaille, keep in mind you don't have to go directly in without any guideline whatsoever. You have the option to draw this out ahead of time. And I would encourage you to, if you're at home or you have a longer working time available to you, I would encourage you to spend as long as you need to on the drawing aspect of this type of painting, because really that's where the accuracy, the likeness is going to come in. Color, you can actually be a little bit flexible with. You can make things overall a little too pink or green or orange or whatever you want, and you have some degree of flexibility on the chroma and saturation. But if your shapes are wrong, then you're going to have to go back and try to lay on top of color, and if the paint is wet and you try to lay on top of it to correct it, sometimes that doesn't work out as well as we hope. And especially if you don't have enough paint on there, then trying to correct with more paint will tend to make things a little too muddy, a little too obscure. You'll lose all your edge quality and your distinction of shape. Now, working with more paint, we can tend to overcome that, but there is the risk that you end up with a lot of paint buildup on your canvas if you're constantly having to correct your drawing. So we want to have pretty high drawing skills if we're going to lay in directly without any preliminary drawing. Otherwise, take out a willow, take out charcoal pencil, something, anything to give yourself some guidelines and be comfortable with those guidelines before you start laying in the paint. That way you don't have to sacrifice the quality of your color when building up the color blocking. After this week, we have a couple more weeks where, I think it's 2 weeks, where you are allowed to select the buildup of your choice. My preferred methods, at least for figure, typically are either an open grisaille block-in, which I layer the color on top of, or a color block-in where I've thinned the paint a little bit, more like the Bosch method of working, and then lay on top of it from there. Those are my two typical working methods. If you'd like to see more of the thinned out Bosch method, which is essentially a color block-in, but it's a color block-in where the colors are thinned out with thinner so that they end up being a little bit lighter overall and take on the appearance more of a watercolor painting. That's going to be visible in the painting demonstration of the portrait. So the extended portrait painting demonstration has a Bosch use. So again, that's a thinned out color block-in. And if I'm not mistaken, if you haven't viewed it already, the still life painting, extended still life painting, has a more full color block-in used to establish all the relationships, and then layers built on top of it from there. So you can kind of see the difference in how they're each used, and we really still need to be pretty confident with the drawing in either case. I believe it's the 3-session figure pose for next block, the final block of painting, utilizes a drawing and then a transfer onto toned canvas, and then laying on the color, a kind of window shading from there on top of an open grisaille. And then the long session figure painting, which I think is something like 6 or 7 sessions long, that follows a very similar process. I think it's just treated one section at a time. So for the face, there's an open grisaille for the face, and then color laid on top of it from there. So a few different techniques, options you have to work with. If you're, again, you can reference those videos if you want to see how they kind of pan out. Maybe just look at them quickly. And then I really encourage you to select a method after today that you really like, either the open grisaille that we did a couple weeks ago, the closed grisaille from last week, or the color block in here, and how thick of paint for that color block in. And then key that to be the method of working that you want to do. And if you have an artist that you particularly favor, living or dead, it's paramount that you select the artist whose work you like and want to paint like, and then figure out which method they started with. You know, if it's a living artist, there's lots and lots of instructional videos out there, or even step-by-steps that you can kind of look at to see what method. For the most part, it's a variation of one of these, or you know, they come in different combinations. You know, this much drawing and then a block in, or no block in direct painting, or a little bit of drawing and some color blocking. You know, everybody has a different working process, and again, the working process contributes to the overall end quality of the work. So you want to really lock on to what they're doing. You know, if they're working really direct with little or no underpainting, that's usually indicative of very high drawing skills, so you want to make sure you revisit the earlier videos to brush up on your drawing, because you have to be pretty spectacular in your drawing the more direct you want to work. And if you want your work to still look direct, but you're not confident in your drawing, just do a preliminary drawing on the side and then maybe transfer it and then work it the way you would, except that now you'll have a guideline for your drawing. So that's what we're working with this week. Remember, large brushes, try to keep your color nice and clean, step back quite a bit. You want to see how those big color relationships work together, and then wait until the very end or the next day to soften your edges.